I got involved in this because I was at the University of Pennsylvania in 1966 to 7 and found that they were doing chemical and biological warfare research on campus for the Pentagon, and this was a big controversy with many major demonstrations, etc. I thought this was interesting and wrote about it and sent it back to the New Statesman out of the blue, and for some reason they printed it. And that put me in touch with something that was happening over here, which was that I think, particularly involving Stephen, there already was an interest in research on campus in Britain onto chemical and biological warfare. And there was a conference in 1968?
The CBW conference?
Yes.
Yeah.
Thereabouts at the Bonington Hotel, I seem to remember, and I joined in with that. And some of the people involved in that were concerned about, this is a misuse of science. But wait a minute, it's not the only misuse of science. Maybe we should talk about how science is used in this sort of society. And it sort of started off from there as far as I was aware. And it wasn't a very sophisticated understanding. And these meetings sort of started in people's houses and then moved to pub rooms where people got to hear about it, and it got bigger and bigger. And we started having lecture rooms in Birkbeck, I seem to remember. And eventually the thing was launched. But there was that initial link to chemical and biological warfare, so that when BSSRS was launched in 69, it was just the year after CS gas had been used in the riots in, well, gas had been used in the riots in Paris in 1968, and the suffusion of the bogside in Derry with CS gas followed in 69. So it became something for us, an obvious one for BSSRS in its early days to pick up. And because we had experts like Stephen who knew about chemistry or biology, and I didn't know any of that, but they then started using another form of riot control, which was called plastic bullets. So I picked up the tab for campaigning on plastic bullets, which are those. And these things are shot out of guns, obviously. They're not just lobbed at people. And
simultaneous decisions that shows that artifacts.
Yes, absolutely. And then when these were proved to be absolutely too dangerous, they produced the plastic bullet, which surprisingly is just about as dangerous. But they killed altogether about 16 people in north of Ireland. Most of them were children. That, so far so good or so bad. And then in 1971 there was internment without trial. And when they got the presumed official and provisional IRA prisons inside, they subjected them to sensory deprivation and interrogation. And so that was another instance of technology being used for suppressing political dissent. And Tim Challis, who I knew from before and was in the Socialist Workers' Party at the time, and regarded BSSRS as a totally reformist bourgeois group, was persuaded to use his psychology to critique the sensory deprivation techniques that were being used. And the result of that was that the two of us particularly produced this pamphlet from BSSRS in 1974 called The New Technology of Repression, Lessons from Ireland. And we were assisted very much in this by some members of the Troops Out movement, particularly somebody called Jerry Lawless, who probably not many of you would have heard of. It was a very charismatic and difficult person on the Irish Republican movement. And that developed because we realized there was something going on here. And over the next couple of years, we worked at it and produced this book, which is called The Technology of Political Control, with two other people. So it was Tim and myself, Carol Ackroyd and Karen Margulis, and that came out by Penguin in 74. And they didn't reprint it, but Pluto did, the revised edition, so I got a big bag here, in I think about 1980. And then there was another book, which came out through Free Association Books, which Bob Young and Les Levidow were involved in running, and that was called Technocop, and it took the story through till 1985. So we have here something going on for quite a decade or more. We got quite politically active. We joined up with Liberty, I think it had a different name at the time, and set up something called the Campaign Against Plastic Bullets, which was moderately successful and helped to spread the word about how dangerous these things were. We got motions passed at Labour Party conferences. And in fact, I suspect that some of that pressure may be the reason why these things have not, as yet, been used on the mainland and only employed on the Irish. There are these cultural differences. For example, before any of these bullets, there was the wooden bullet, which was used to suppress riots in Hong Kong a few years previously, but they decided that wooden bullets wouldn't go down well on British TV. So they changed to something with a slightly more innocuous sounding name.
More friendly. More friendly.
Yeah, absolutely. So, we're rushing through this at a great speed. The new technology of repression, wherever that got to, just covered water cannon, rubber bullets, and sensory deprivation. The bigger book, covered those as well as plastic bullets, tapping and bugging, computers for intelligence purposes, and quite a lot on the theory, what we call the theory of the strong state, which was to look at how a state which wished to suppress dissent successfully what are the ways of doing it? There is fascism, there is military dictatorship, there is possibly, to maintain the forms of parliamentary democracy, you need not to have too overt repression, and we thought these technologies were designed to keep people down without actually provoking something which would produce such a big backlash that they would lose the whole game. These were turbulent times I'm talking about. It's not like it is now. The inflation, for example, in 1974 was 16%. In 1975, the next year it was 24%, and even 5 years later, inflation was still running at 18%. There were more than one reason for this, but we had a very strong and active trade union movement. It was very hard to make the working class pay for the problems of capitalism at that time, but there was a feeling among the power elite that Britain was on the verge of being ungovernable. And there were strong rumours, which I think are now pretty clear, that there was the incipient military coup being planned at that time, with possibly Lord Mountbatten as the figurehead to take over the running of the country. And we saw an apocalypse coming with all sorts of difficulties, but this was the alternative to the military takeover, and we tried to analyse that. It didn't quite happen the way we thought it would. Of course, the actual crisis was the miners' strike, which took place in 1985, and in fact they didn't use any of this. They used amazing numbers of police, massed ranks of police and police forces, no visible technology beyond riot shields and batons. But they had things, of course, behind the scenes. They were using information technology for all it was worth, intercepting people, using the law, selectively picking out people and tying up the National Union of Miners in legal knots and all of those sorts of things. So they did, in fact, find a slightly different way of handling it than what we thought would be, which would be all this hardware. So where are we? We're in a new crisis of capitalism. It's a very long-running one. We're 30 years on from 1985, and we find different measures of social control being employed. We have the prevent strategy, suppressing dangerous ideas on campus. We have for example, the cancellation of I don't know if you've all heard about this, of the conference planned for a week's time at the University of Southampton, an academic conference promoted by 2 professors at the university, which has been closed down by pressure from Zionist groups and cabinet ministers and MPs and so on. So that there's a strong thrust of social control going on at the moment to stop dangerous things from happening. But we also have the leakage of this sort of technology into our society. We now have tasers authorized for use and repeatedly used. In our book, tasers are mentioned, but as the sort of crazy toy that will never be used. But in fact, they're now there. And also we mentioned the idea of tagging, which we thought was some crazy American idea. but not realising that this would come. Water cannon have now been bought by the Mayor of London, which were never allowed in Great Britain till now. Kettling is a sophisticated version of what the police were doing at Orgreave and so on, but in very different circumstances. Communication interception is an extension of what we never dreamed of when we talked about intelligence and computers over there. So there's a lot of things that are taking the agenda forward, I think, at the moment. So there's lots to think about. In the 60s and 70s, the technology that we were looking at much of it came from the colonial exploits of imperialism, and also, of course, from the Vietnam War. So the use of gas came from there. Night vision devices, which became into the police at that time, again came from that period, and so on. So Vietnam was a laboratory out of which leaked technologies that came home to the metropolitan countries. Now what we have is Palestine. Palestine is the laboratory where new methods of social control and right control, and of course lethal technologies too, are deployed persistently. So this, I think, is a new situation which we have to think about. It has parallels with what we were looking at 13, 40 years ago. There are obviously new elements, and the questions which I don't have the answers to, but which I think any kind of movement we have should be discussing, is how do we resist these forms of enhancement of the power of the state, and what is the role for scientists in doing that? Thank you.